Brooks's laugh cut through the room like shrapnel. She thinks she belongs with real pilots. The others didn't even hide their smirks. Colonel Martinez didn't look up from his coffee before dismissing her mission outright. Sarah Chen stayed perfectly still, hands clasped, jaw tight. The sting of 5 years' worth of humiliations pressed against her ribs, but she didn't flinch. They thought she was just a transport pilot. They didn't know she'd flown into kill zones before most of them had seen real combat. They didn't know the classified missions, the men she'd carried out alive when the math said they shouldn't have made it. And she didn't know yet that one piece of paper, buried in a file no one had ever read, would flip the entire power dynamic in this room. The laughter died the moment she slid a weathered photograph onto the table. Flames, smoke, a lone figure hauling a body from a burning helicopter. Martinez's hand trembled as he picked it up. Sarah met his eyes, steady as steel. "I don't fly for glory, sir. I fly to bring people home." Captain Sarah Chen stood quietly near the far wall of the briefing room, her posture precise and military perfect, but her mind bracing for what was coming. Across the table, a cluster of pilots traded grins and muffled chuckles, their amusement directed squarely at her. "Look at her," Lieutenant Brooks muttered to the man beside him. Loud enough for the words to carry. "Thinks she's one of us, like she belongs with the real pilots." The smirks multiplied, feeding on one another until the whole group was in on the joke. Colonel Martinez didn't so much as glance her way when she presented the mission proposal she had spent the last 2 nights refining. He sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. "Chen," he said, his voice as flat as his expression, "you're a transport pilot. Leave the dangerous stuff to the combat boys." The laughter broke out again, louder this time, echoing in the narrow room like the crack of a hand against skin. Sarah stayed rooted to the spot, hands clasped behind her back, her face giving away nothing, though inside the heat of humiliation rose like fire under her ribs. Lieutenant Brooks leaned back in his chair, rocking it just enough to look relaxed, that self-satisfied grin tugging at his mouth. "Desk pilots should stick to moving supplies," he added. "Leave the war games to the ones who don't freeze when things get real." The air shifted. The chuckles faded into a sharp, brittle silence, the sting of his words lingering long after the sound died. Sarah scanned the faces around the table, one by one. She saw the same dismissive eyes she'd been meeting for 5 years, men who had never bothered to read her service record, who didn't know she'd been in a cockpit since the age of 16, and who had no clue what she had endured before the Air Force ever handed her a flight suit. Without speaking, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. She stepped forward and set it in front of Colonel Martinez. The picture showed a helicopter engulfed in flames on a barren stretch of desert. In the foreground, a lone figure staggered away from the wreckage, carrying an unconscious man slung over one shoulder. The room went still. Martinez picked up the photo and stared at it, his jaw tightening, his complexion paling as the recognition hit him. His fingers trembled, almost imperceptibly. This can't be," he murmured. Sarah said nothing. She didn't need to. She had learned the art of invisibility long before the Air Force. As the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who each worked 3 jobs, she grew up watching her parents endure quiet indignities with grace. Her father, once a respected engineer, spent his American years repairing air conditioners in sweltering apartments. Her mother, a former literature teacher, scrubbed offices at night while the city slept. They never demanded recognition. They simply worked harder, heads down, voices low. Sarah absorbed the lesson early. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't announce their strength. At 17, a school guidance counselor suggested she might qualify for a military scholarship. That conversation put her in the pilot's seat of a Cessna for the first time. The instant her hands gripped the controls and the ground fell away, something inside her expanded, like a pair of wings had been waiting all her life to unfold. Up there, no one could judge her by her last name, her skin tone, or the faint accent that lingered in her speech. Up there, she was nothing but skill, precision, and instinct. The military gave her freedom, but it also gave her a new kind of invisibility. She graduated 3rd in her flight school class, yet somehow always ended up on transport runs while others, Men with far less skill were handed the missions that made careers. She told herself it didn't matter, that flying itself was enough, but alone at night in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if she would spend her whole career being the one no one noticed. She thought of her parents who had traded their dreams for hers and asked herself if she was wasting those sacrifices by not demanding more. Her colleagues didn't know she had a private ritual. Every morning before dawn, she ran 5 miles, not for speed, not even for fitness. She ran for the quiet. In those shadowed hours, with only her breath and her footsteps for company, she remembered why she flew. Not for medals, not for applause, but because in the air, above the noise and judgment, she was exactly who she was meant to be. She had become an expert at preparing for moments no one expected her to face. While others boasted about their skills, she studied. While they celebrated victories, she was readying herself for the missions no one else wanted. She knew that someday, when the moment finally came, she would already be ready. And in that briefing room, as Colonel Martinez's hands shook over a photograph he could not reconcile with the woman standing in front of him, Sarah realized maybe that moment had just arrived. At the Texas base, reputation always seemed to arrive before the truth. The ones who spoke the loudest tended to be the ones everyone listened to, and Sarah Chen had spent the past 5 years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight. Around her, the air practically buzzed with the restless energy of young pilots. Most fresh out of flight school, their confidence untouched by the kind of real crises that could strip a person bare. The pilot lounge had its own unspoken geography, an invisible map everyone followed. The combat pilots gravitated to the tables by the windows, lounging in flight suits unzipped just enough to display squadron patches like badges of superiority. Transport pilots clustered nearer to the coffee machine, their conversations grounded in cargo manifests, weather delays, and the logistics no one celebrated. Sarah typically sat alone, a plate untouched beside her, eyes scanning technical manuals while the others traded exaggerated stories about aerial maneuvers they'd likely never attempted in their lives. Colonel Martinez commanded the base with the precision of an older generation of military leaders, where hierarchy was sacred and questioning orders was not only frowned upon, but could end a career before it began. 20 years earlier, he'd flown combat missions himself, and he still seemed to measure every pilot against the version of himself he'd been back then. That meant a natural bias toward the brash young men who reminded him of those days. Men like Lieutenant Brooks, who'd never been under real enemy fire, but could spin a tale about it as if he'd personally rewritten history. The handful of other women on base had learned quickly that survival required a choice: become louder, sharper, and more aggressive than the men, or transfer out before the place ground you down. Sarah had taken a third route entirely. She built a reputation for flawless technical skill, so impeccable that even those who disliked her couldn't deny her abilities. But she had also learned that competence was not the same as respect. Her quarters reflected her guarded nature, sparsely decorated, functional to the core. A single photograph showed her parents at their naturalization ceremony. On a shelf sat a small model of the helicopter in which she'd first learned to fly. The rest was shelves lined with flight manuals, each one annotated in her small, precise handwriting. Personal observations, alternative calculations, margins crowded with thoughts only she understood. Few of her colleagues knew that she'd committed to memory the specifications for every aircraft on the base, not just the ones she was cleared to fly. It was in the Mission Control Center where Sarah felt most at ease. Here, surrounded by the glow of radar screens and the steady hum of communications equipment, she could monitor weather systems sweeping across 3 states, coordinate with air traffic controllers, and track aircraft movements with a meticulous precision that bordered on artistry. Most of the other pilots dismissed this as proof she was better suited for a desk than a cockpit. They didn't realize that her ability to see the entire operational picture made her an even more formidable pilot when she was in the air. Every day began the same: arriving before dawn, reviewing the night's weather data, and going over the day's flight schedule in quiet concentration. She noted which pilots had which assignments, mentally preparing for the routine missions that would inevitably land in her lap: supply runs, training flights, the essential but unglamorous work that kept the base functional but never made headlines. Then came the call. At 03:47 hours, a Tuesday in October, the radio cut through the stillness of mission control with a crackle that made her heart seize. She had been awake for hours already, absorbed in meteorological charts, when the voice broke through. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger 17. We are going down. Repeat, we are going down. The transmission was ragged, choked with static, layered with the distant wail of alarms. Multiple casualties. GPS coordinates follow. Her hands moved instinctively, pulling up satellite imagery the moment the coordinates came through. One glance was enough to knot her stomach. A desolate stretch of the Guadalupe Mountains, where jagged ridges and sudden violent winds had claimed aircraft before. A storm front was sweeping in from the west, wind shear strong enough to ground most aircraft within hours. Within minutes, the briefing room was crowded. Colonel Martinez stood at the front, grim-faced, laying out the facts. Ranger 17 was a medevac helicopter returning from a humanitarian mission in Mexico, carrying 6 people, 2 of them civilians. The last message reported mechanical failure and a possible crash landing in terrain nearly impossible to reach by ground. We need a rescue bird in the air within the hour, Martinez said, scanning the room. Who here is qualified for mountain rescue in deteriorating weather? Sarah rose. Sir, I am. Every head turned. She knew those looks, skepticism written plain across their faces. Lieutenant Brooks even let out a sharp laugh. Chen, this isn't a cargo run to Dallas. This is a combat, search, and rescue mission. I understand that, sir, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I'm qualified on the MH-60 Blackhawk. I've completed advanced weather flight certification. I also have extensive experience with high-altitude operations. Martinez narrowed his eyes. And when exactly did you get high-altitude experience? Before this posting, sir, I spent 18 months in Afghanistan. Primarily, the air in the operations room shifted the moment the words medical evacuation missions in mountainous terrain left Colonel Martinez's lips. Conversation died instantly, as if someone had cut the power. Sarah sat still, her expression unreadable. She had never once mentioned her previous deployment, not her combat flights, not the risks she'd taken, not the nights she'd flown with adrenaline pounding in her veins and the odds stacked against her. She had never tried to match the war stories the other pilots swapped like trading cards over coffee. Across the table, Lieutenant Brooks' grin faltered, his eyes narrowing in uncertainty. He had been laughing only moments ago. Martinez spoke slowly, measuring each word. This is a mission for our most seasoned combat pilots. Brooks, you'll lead. Sarah caught the faint blanch of Brooks's face, a change no one else seemed to notice. She knew something the others didn't. For all his bravado about combat readiness, Brooks had never flown in conditions like these. Truth be told, none of them had. She drew a steady breath. Sir, she said quietly, I respectfully request to be considered for this mission. There was something in her tone, calm, unwavering, that made the room fall silent again. Brooks stood abruptly, jaw tight, irritation sharp in his voice. Colonel, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of mission where we can't afford to gamble on unproven pilots. His gaze locked on Sarah, cold and appraising. Chen, you're a solid transport pilot, maybe even a great one. But this isn't hauling supplies from point A to point B. This is combat rescue in hostile terrain with lives in the balance. Sarah felt the familiar sting, being minimized, reduced to the safest, most obvious version of her role. She met his eyes evenly. I understand the stakes, Lieutenant. Do you? Brooks' reply was a whip crack. When you're flying into a storm in a mountain range, with wounded people counting on you to keep them alive, there's no space for hesitation, no second guessing. You need instincts only earned under fire. Martinez nodded slowly. Brooks has a point, Chen. This mission demands someone who's been tested in combat. I have been tested, sir. Flying cargo in Afghanistan isn't the same as, I wasn't flying cargo in Afghanistan. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut cleanly through the air. I was flying medical evacuation missions, 97 successful rescues in 18 months, 15 of those under direct enemy fire. The silence in the room grew heavier. Brooks's confident mask slipped, but he rallied. Even if that's true, this is different. The mountains, the weather, the technical challenges, Sarah finished, her voice still calm but edged with steel, are exactly the conditions I trained for. I've studied every inch of the Guadalupe Range. I know the wind patterns, the thermal dynamics, every viable landing zone. I know which approaches will save lives and which will kill everyone on board. Brooks's face flushed. You think you know better than combat pilots who've been at this for years? I think I know better than pilots who've never done this at all. The words hung in the air, a clear challenge she instantly regretted, not because they weren't true, but because she'd broken her own rule. Keep your head down, stay invisible. Don't give them a reason to turn all eyes on you. But now every gaze in the room was fixed on her. Martinez's tone hardened. That's enough, Captain Chen. She inclined her head slightly. Sir, I apologize. But 6 people are out there dying while we stand here debating who's qualified to save them. They'll stay dead if we send the wrong pilot, Brooks shot back. Chen, you're fine for routine runs, but this is not routine. This is life and death. You can't freeze when the situation turns to hell. Something broke inside Sarah. 5 years of being overlooked, underestimated, brushed aside. 5 years of watching less qualified pilots get the missions she could have flown better. 5 years of swallowing her words while men who had never proven themselves picked apart her capabilities. You're right, she said softly. This is life and death. From her flight suit pocket, she pulled out a small, weathered notebook. She'd carried it for 3 years, never showing it, never speaking of it. Its pages were dense with her handwriting, a record of every mission, every choice, every life saved or lost. Afghanistan, she opened to a page marked by a faded red ribbon. March 15th, medical evacuation in Kunar province. 3 wounded Marines pinned down on a ridgeline. Enemy fire from 2 sides. Weather closing in fast. She looked up. Around the table, skepticism shifted into attentive stillness. The mission commander called it too dangerous. Said we should wait for the weather to break, call in airstrikes, handle it through proper channels. Brooks frowned. What does this have to do with, I went anyway? Her voice didn't waver, but there was something in it, something that made everyone lean forward without realizing. I took an MH-60 Blackhawk into a box canyon at night, in a snowstorm, with Taliban firing from both ridges. I set her down on a ledge barely wider than the skids, loaded 3 Marines who were bleeding out, and flew them to safety through a mountain pass that wasn't supposed to be flyable under those conditions. The room had fallen into a heavy, unnatural stillness. No one shuffled papers anymore. Colonel Martinez's hands rested motionless on the desk, the last sheet he'd touched now lying forgotten. Even Brooks, who always seemed to have something to say, sat in complete silence, his eyes fixed on Sarah as if afraid that speaking might break whatever spell hung over the room. The mission report was classified, Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to pull the air tighter around them. The Marines I pulled out that day belonged to a special operations unit that officially didn't exist. So there was no medal, no recognition, not even a single entry in my service record. Just 3 men who went home to their families instead of dying on a mountainside. She closed the battered notebook in her hands, the sound sharp in the stillness, and met Colonel Martinez's gaze head on. That was the first time I saved lives no one would ever know about. It wasn't the last. Martinez studied her face as though truly seeing her for the first time in all the years they'd served together. How many times, Chen? He asked quietly. Her answer was steady, precise. 23 missions that never appeared in any official report. 47 lives saved that the military couldn't acknowledge. And every single time, I flew alone because every other pilot called it too dangerous. The silence that followed stretched until it felt almost physical. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She felt the slow, invisible release of a burden she had carried for years, a weight she had never allowed herself to speak about. She had never been the kind of pilot who needed to boast, never sought the nods and congratulations that came with public heroics. But the dismissive skepticism she'd faced in this room had pushed her past her usual restraint. I don't fly for recognition, she said at last, her voice low but unwavering. I don't fly for glory or career points or to earn the approval of other pilots. I fly because when people are dying, someone has to be willing to go get them. And I have never, not once, failed to bring them home. As she rose from her chair, decision already made. Sir, I'm requesting permission to attempt this rescue mission. Not because I'm the best pilot here, but because I'm the only one who's actually done this before. Colonel Martinez didn't speak right away. He simply regarded her for a long, thoughtful moment, then reached for the phone on his desk. Get me General Patterson at Special Operations Command, he said quietly to his aide. While they waited, no one spoke. The weight of Sarah's words seemed to settle over everyone in the room, thick as a winter blanket. When the phone finally rang twice and a voice answered, Martinez spoke crisply. General Patterson, sir, this is Colonel Martinez at Randolph AFB. I need to verify classified mission records for Captain Sarah Chen, Afghanistan deployment, 2021 to 22. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of shuffling papers and rapid keystrokes. Then Patterson's voice came back, sharp and incredulous. Jesus Christ, Martinez, where did you find this pilot? She's been under my command for 5 years, sir. 5 years, Patterson repeated, his tone edged with disbelief. And you didn't know? Now there was something else in his voice, something close to respect. Martinez, Chen has the highest mission success rate of any pilot in theater. We've been trying to bring her into special operations for 2 years, but she keeps turning us down. Sarah felt every eye in the room shift toward her. She had never mentioned the offers, never spoken about those classified flights, never once tried to leverage her record for personal gain. She had simply done her job and kept her silence. Sir, Martinez said slowly, we have a rescue situation in the Guadalupe Mountains. Weather's deteriorating, terrain's hostile. Chen is requesting permission to attempt the mission. Then give it to her, Patterson replied without hesitation. And Martinez, next time you have a pilot like Chen under your command, maybe try reading her service record. The line went dead. Martinez replaced the phone in its cradle, his eyes still locked on Sarah. There was a new expression there, genuine respect, edged with something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Chen, he said quietly, you have a go for the mission. What do you need? Her mind shifted instantly into operational mode. An MH-60 Blackhawk with extended-range fuel tanks, full medical gear for multiple casualties, clearance to fly in restricted airspace. I'll need real-time weather updates and the latest satellite imagery of the crash site. Done. How long until you're airborne? 20 minutes. Lieutenant Brooks finally found his voice. Chen, I owe you an apology. I didn't know. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied gently, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. You just didn't have all the information. Now you do. She was halfway to the door before pausing to glance back. And Brooks, when I get back, maybe we can go over some of the techniques I learned in Afghanistan. You're a good pilot. With the right training, you could be an excellent one. It was the first time in 5 years that Sarah walked out of a briefing room with her head held high, certain she was exactly where she was meant to be. Minutes later, the Black Hawk rose into a gray dawn, its rotors slicing through the thick, unsettled air. Sarah was at the controls, 6 lives depending on her, the responsibility pressing like a physical weight across her shoulders. The storm was worsening faster than the forecasts had warned. Wind gusts slammed against the aircraft, flirting with the edge of its operational limits. Visibility had fallen to less than a mile. Through her headset came the overlapping voices of air traffic control, weather services, and rescue coordination, each feeding her updates, each monitoring her slow progress into the mountains. Rescue 1, this is base control. Latest weather shows the storm system intensifying. Recommend you abort and return to base. Sarah kept her eyes locked on the instrument panel, feeling the aircraft shudder and groan as it fought its way through the churning turbulence. The air around them seemed alive, violent, unpredictable, each gust of wind striking from a different direction, like an unseen hand trying to push them out of the sky. 30 miles still lay between her and the GPS coordinates for the crash site, buried deep in a jagged canyon system that would test even the most seasoned pilots under perfect blue skies. In weather like this, it wasn't just dangerous, it was brushing the edge of suicide. The radio crackled, the voice sharp with command authority. Base control to Rescue 1, Continue toward the target. Chen, this is Colonel Martinez. I am ordering you to abort. The weather is too dangerous. Sarah closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the colonel's words colliding with another voice in her memory, one that had carried pure fear. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger 17, we are going down. That plea had been raw and desperate. She could still hear it echoing inside her, layered with the knowledge of who was on board. A medical team, people who had dedicated their lives to saving strangers. Now they were the ones lying hurt and exposed in the mountains, with a storm swallowing their only hope of rescue. Her reply came steady and respectful, but firm. Sir, with respect, I'm continuing this mission. The next 20 minutes became the longest stretch of Sarah's life. She flew by instruments alone, no landmarks, no visual horizon, trusting her training, her instincts, and a lifetime of muscle memory. The aircraft bucked under her, wind slamming the fuselage as if testing her will. Through gaps in the clouds, the canyon walls would flicker into sight, sheer stone cliffs that loomed and then vanished again in a swirling maze of gray mist and shadows. This was flying on the knife's edge, every decision and micro-adjustment critical. When the wreck finally came into view, her heart sank hard. The downed helicopter had smashed into a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall. There was barely enough flat rock to attempt a landing, and the approach meant threading the Black Hawk between jagged outcroppings with a margin for error measured in feet. No, inches. She keyed her mic. Rescue 1 to base control. I have visual on the crash site. Attempting landing. The answer came fast. Chen, negative. The LZ is too small and the wind shear is too severe. Pull back and wait for the storm to pass. From her vantage point, Sarah could make out shapes moving near the wreckage. Survivors, some upright, some slumped against the twisted frame. She didn't need to run the numbers to know that the storm wasn't going to pass anytime soon. Waiting wasn't a safer option. It was a death sentence. Base control, she said, voice low but certain. I'm going in. She brought the Black Hawk into a descent so precise it demanded every shred of focus from her 15 years of flight experience. Rotor blades whipped within inches of rock. The skids barely found purchase on the ledge. The moment she touched down, figures emerged from the shadows. 3 able to walk, 2 clearly unable to move without help. But as the last injured man was loaded toward the cabin, reality hit her like a punch. The weight gauge was already flirting with the red zone. Between the 6 survivors and the fuel needed for the return trip, there was no safe way to carry everyone. Someone would have to stay behind. Her gaze fell on the injured pilot of the crashed helicopter, a young man who couldn't have been long out of flight school. I'm not leaving without you, she told him. You have to, he said, his voice thin but resolute. I'm too hurt to move, and you can't lift us all. Get them out of here. Sarah looked from him to the faces of the others, the fear, the hope, and then to her fuel readouts and the growing storm warnings flashing on her console. She had minutes to decide, and she knew this choice would live with her forever. That day, Sarah made 3 trips. The first carried the most critically injured, a doctor with internal injuries and a medic with a shattered leg. The second brought out the remaining survivors, including a young nurse who gripped Sarah's hand, whispering broken thank yous through her tears. The third trip was the most grueling, returning alone into the teeth of the storms to bring back the pilot who had waited on that ledge for 2 hours, wind screaming around him like a predator circling its prey. When Sarah finally landed with the last survivor, Randolph Air Force Base was already buzzing. Mechanics, clerks, and pilots from other squadrons crowded the tarmac as ambulances rolled forward to take the rescued inside. Word had spread. What she had done wasn't just difficult, it bordered on impossible. Hours later, the base hospital confirmed all 6 survivors would make full recoveries, something that would never have been true if she had followed the order to wait. Sarah sat in the Black Hawk's cockpit for a long time after shutting down the engines, her hands trembling as the adrenaline bled away. She had flown for 6 relentless hours in conditions that had grounded every other aircraft in the region. She had executed landings that would be dissected in flight schools for years to come. She had refused to stand down, and because of that, 6 people were alive. When she finally climbed down onto the tarmac, she found Colonel Martinez waiting for her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she braced for the formal charge, for the words court-martial. Instead, his voice came quiet. Chen, I owe you an apology. Several, in fact. Sir, that's not necessary, she replied. It is, he said without hesitation. I've commanded pilots for 20 years, and I've never seen flying like that. More importantly, I've never seen courage like that. From the edge of the crowd, Lieutenant Brooks stepped forward, his face flushed with something between shame and admiration. Chen, I was wrong about everything. You're not just a good... Sarah had never been one for the spotlight. For 5 long years, she'd blended into the background, a quiet presence in a place where loud confidence usually won the day. But now, the room was different. The air felt heavier, charged with something unfamiliar. Faces turned toward her, faces she knew well, yet somehow didn't recognize in this moment. She saw respect in their eyes, admiration, and maybe, just maybe, a trace of awe. It was disorienting, almost uncomfortable to suddenly be at the center of everyone's attention. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't chased it. She would have been just as content to finish the day unnoticed, the way she always had. I just did my job, she said softly, almost apologetically. No, Colonel Martinez answered firmly, his voice carrying across the room. You did what the rest of us were too scared to do. You flew into hell, and you brought everyone back alive. The words seemed to hang in the air, weighty and impossible to brush aside. Eventually, the crowd began to break apart, people drifting toward the exits. But something had shifted. When Sarah walked past, people stepped aside, not to dismiss her, but out of respect. The other pilots met her eyes now, giving her subtle nods instead of the casual indifference she'd grown used to. It was a small thing, but she felt the change like a current in the air. Later that night, when the base had gone quiet, Sarah sat alone in her quarters. The ring of her phone startled her. She glanced at the screen and recognized the number from the base hospital. Captain Chen, this is Dr. Martinez from the medical team you rescued today, the voice on the other end said. I just wanted to thank you and to tell you something else. You didn't just save our lives today. You saved the lives of every patient we'll treat for the rest of our careers. Sarah sat in silence for a moment after the call ended, letting the words sink in. She had no medal in her hands, no public ceremony, no cameras, but the gratitude in that voice felt heavier and truer than any award. 3 months later, she found herself in the same briefing room where she had been dismissed and underestimated more times than she cared to count. But the atmosphere was entirely different now. Colonel Martinez had put her name forward for promotion, and she had been selected to lead a brand new mountain rescue training program. The same pilots who once ignored her now sought her guidance. Missions she'd been routinely denied were now entrusted to her without hesitation. Even Lieutenant Brooks, the hotshot who used to swagger through training sessions, had become one of her most attentive students. After a particularly grueling flight exercise, Brooks lingered behind. I mean Major Chen, he corrected himself quickly. I've been thinking about what you said, about not flying for recognition or glory. I think maybe I've been doing this for the wrong reasons. Sarah smiled faintly. We all start flying for the wrong reasons, Brooks. The important thing is figuring out the right ones before it's too late. He looked genuinely thoughtful. And what are the right reasons? That's something you have to discover for yourself, she said. But I'll tell you this. The best pilots I've known fly because they can't imagine doing anything else. Because somewhere up there, above all the noise and politics and competition, they find something that makes them whole. That evening, back in her quarters, Sarah opened a letter that had arrived in the day's mail. It was from the nurse she'd rescued, the one who had been badly injured but was now back at work. The letter was short, written in simple, deliberate handwriting. Thank you for reminding me that there are still heroes in the world, not the kind who seek attention, but the kind who simply do what needs to be done when no one is watching. Sarah folded the letter with care and placed it in her desk drawer alongside 2 treasures, her father's naturalization certificate and her mother's Warren Teaching Award. Each was a quiet reminder of strength that didn't need applause, of dignity in the face of doubt, and of the power of simply doing your job with skill, whether or not anyone noticed. She turned to look out the window. On the flight line below, crews were preparing aircraft for the next day's missions. Somewhere out there, someone would need rescuing. Somewhere out there, impossible choices would have to be made. And somewhere out there, pilots would discover whether they had the courage to fly into danger and bring people home. Sarah had learned the truth. Respect wasn't something you could demand or win through politics or self-promotion. It came from showing up, from competence, from being willing to do the things others hesitated to do. She'd spent 5 invisible years preparing for the one moment that truly counted. Tomorrow morning, she would wake before dawn and run 5 miles in the dark, just as she always had. But now she wouldn't be running to escape the noise. She would be running toward peace. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, not the pilot with the most recognition, but the pilot who brought everyone home. Because true strength isn't found in shouting your achievements from the rooftops. It lives in quiet competence, in the steady hands and steady hearts of those who act when no one's watching. Recognition may come in time, but it should never be the reason you strive for excellence.